Carthage was the center capital city of the ancient Carthaginian civilization, on the eastern side of the Lake of Tunis in what is now the Tunis Governorate in Tunisia. The city developed from a Phoenician colony into the capital of an empire dominating the Mediterranean Sea during the first millennium BC. The ancient city was destroyed by the Roman Republic in the Third Punic War in 146 BC, then redeveloped as Roman Carthage, which became the major city of the Roman Empire in the province of Africa. The Roman city was again occupied by the Muslim conquest of the Maghreb in 698. The site remained uninhabited, the regional power shifting to the Medina of Tunis in the medieval period, until the early 20th century, when it began to develop into a coastal suburb of Tunis, incorporated as Carthage municipality in 1919. The archaeological site was first surveyed in 1830, by Danish consul Christian Tuxen Falb. Excavations were performed in the second half of the 19th century by Charles Ernest Buller and by Alfred Louis Delata. The Carthage National Museum was founded in 1875 by Cardinal Charles Leverrier. Excavations performed by French archaeologists in the 1920s attracted an extraordinary amount of attention because of the evidence for child sacrifice they produced, in Greco-Roman and biblical tradition associated with the Canaanite god Moloch. The open-air Carthage Paleo-Christian Museum has exhibits excavated under the auspices of UNESCO from 1975 to 1984. Name. The name Carthage, Carthaginian, is the early modern anglicization of French Carthage, from Latin Carthagard, derived via Greek Carchedon and Etruscan *Carthagrazza, from the Punic Qrthdst, new city, implying it was at new Tyre. The Latin Carthagard, Carthagines, is an N stem, as reflected in the English adjective Carthaginian. The Latin adjective Punicus, a variant of the word Phoenician, is reflected in English in some borrowings from Latin, notably the Punic Wars and the Punic language. The modern Standard Arabic form is an adoption of French Carthage, replacing an older local toponym reported as Cartagena that directly continued the Latin name. Topography. Carthage was built on a promontory with sea inlets to the north and the south. The city's location made it master of the Mediterranean's maritime trade. All ships crossing the sea had to pass between Sicily and the coast of Tunisia, where Carthage was built, affording it great power and influence. Two large artificial harbors were built within the city, one for harboring the city's massive navy of 220 warships and the other for mercantile trade. A walled tower overlooked both harbors. The city had massive walls, 37 kilometers in length, longer than the walls of comparable cities. Most of the walls were located on the shore, thus could be less impressive, as Carthaginian control of the sea made attack from that direction difficult. The 4.0 to 4.8 kilometers of wall on the isthmus to the west were truly massive and were never penetrated. The city had a huge necropolis, a burial ground, religious area, marketplaces, council house, towers, and a theatre, and was divided into 4 equally sized residential areas with the same layout. Roughly in the middle of the city stood a high citadel called the Burso. Carthage was one of the largest cities of the Hellenistic period and was among the largest cities in pre-industrial history, whereas by AD 14, Rome had at least 750,000 inhabitants and in the following century may have reached 1 million. The cities of Alexandria and Antioch numbered only a few 100,000 or less. According to the not always reliable history of Herodian, Carthage rivaled Alexandria Alexandria for second place in the Roman Empire. On top of Bursa Hill, the location of the Roman Forum, a residential area from the last century of existence of the Punic city, was excavated by the French archaeologist Serge Lancel. The neighborhood, with its houses, shops, and private spaces, is significant for what it reveals about daily life there over 2,100 years ago. The remains have been preserved under embankments, the substructures of the later Roman Forum, whose foundation piles dot the district. The housing blocks are separated by a grid of straight streets about 6 meters wide, with a roadway consisting of clay. In situ stairs compensate for the slope of the hill. Construction of this type presupposes organization and political will, and has inspired the name of the neighborhood, Hannibal District, referring to the legendary Punic general Asophat at the beginning of the 2nd century BC. The habitat is typical, even stereotypical. The street was often used as a storefront, shop front. Cisterns were installed in basements to collect water for domestic use, and a long corridor on the right side of each residence led to a courtyard containing a sump, around which various other elements may be found. In some places the ground is covered with mosaics called punica pavement, sometimes using a characteristic red mortar. The merchant harbour at Carthage was developed after settlement of the nearby Punic town of Utica. Eventually the surrounding countryside was brought into the orbit of the Punic urban centres, first commercially, then politically. Direct management over cultivation of neighbouring lands by Punic owners followed. A 28-volume work on agriculture written in Punic by Maghreb, a retired army general, was translated into Latin and later into Greek. The original and both translations have been lost. However, some of Maghreb's text has survived in other Latin works. Olive trees, fruit trees, viniculture, bees, cattle, sheep, poultry, implements, and farm management were among the ancient topics which Maghreb discussed. As well, Maghreb addresses the winemaker's art. In Punic farming society, according to Maghreb, the small estate owners were the chief producers. They were, too, modern historians write, not absent landlords. Rather, the likely reader of Maghreb was the master of a relatively modest estate, from which by great personal exertion, he extracted the maximum yield. Maghreb counseled the rural landowner, for the sake of their own utilitarian interests, to treat carefully and well the managers and farm workers, or their overseers and slaves. Yet elsewhere these writers suggest that rural land ownership provided also a new power base among the city's nobility, for those resident in the country villas. By many, farming was viewed as an alternative endeavor to an urban business. Another modern historian opines that more often it was the urban merchant of Carthage who owned rural farming land to some profit, and also to retire that during the heat of summer. It may seem that Maghreb anticipated such an opinion, and instead issued this contrary advice. The man who acquires an estate must sell his house, lest he prefer to live in the town rather than in the country. Anyone who prefers to live in a town has no need of an estate in the country. Quote, "One who has bought land should sell his town house, so that he will have no desire to worship the household gods of the city rather than those of the country. The man who takes greater delight in his city residence will have no need of a country estate." The issues involved in rural land management also reveal underlying features of Punic society, its structure and stratification. The hired workers might be considered rural proletariat, drawn from the local Berbers. Whether or not there remained Berber landowners next to Punic-run farms is unclear. Some Berbers became sharecroppers. Slaves acquired for farm work were often prisoners of war. In lands outside Punic political control, independent Berbers cultivated grain and raised horses on the lands. Yet within the Punic domain that surrounded the city-state of Carthage, there were ethnic divisions in addition to the usual quasi-feudal distinctions between lord and peasant, or master and serf. This inherent instability in the countryside drew the unwanted attention of potential invaders. Yet for long periods Carthage was able to manage these social difficulties. The many amphorae with Punic markings subsequently found about ancient Mediterranean coastal settlements testify to Carthaginian trade in locally made olive oil and wine. Carthage's agricultural production was held in high regard by the ancients, and rivaled that of Rome. They were once competitors, e.g., over their olive harvests. Under Roman rule, however, grain production for export increased dramatically in Africa, yet these later fell with the rise in Roman Egypt's grain exports. Thereafter olive groves and vineyards were re-established around Carthage. Visitors to the several growing regions that surrounded the city wrote admiringly of the lush green gardens, orchards, fields, irrigation channels, hedgerows, as well as the many prosperous farming towns located across the rural landscape. Accordingly, the Greek author and compiler Diodorus Siculus, who enjoyed access to ancient writings later lost, and on which he based most of his writings, described agricultural land near the city of Carthage circa 310 BC. It was divided into market gardens and orchards of all sorts of fruit trees, with many streams of water flowing in channels irrigating every part. There were country homes everywhere, lavishly built and covered with stucco. Part of the land was planted with vines, part with olives and other productive trees. Beyond these, cattle and sheep were pastured on the plains, and there were meadows with grazing horses. The Chora encompassed a limited area: the north coastal Tell, the lower Bagrades River Valley, Cape Bon, and the adjacent Sahel on the east coast. Punic culture here achieved the introduction of agricultural sciences first developed for lands of the eastern Mediterranean, and their adaptation to local African conditions. The urban landscape of Carthage is known in part from ancient authors, augmented by modern digs and surveys conducted by archaeologists. The first urban nucleus, dating to the 7th century, in area about 10 hectares, was apparently located on low-lying lands along the coast. As confirmed by archaeological excavations, Carthage was a creation ex nihilo, built on virgin land, and situated at the end of a peninsula. Here, among mud brick walls and beaten clay floors, were also found extensive cemeteries, which yielded evocative grave goods like clay masks. Thanks to this burial archaeology, we know more about archaic Carthage than about any other contemporary city in the western Mediterranean. Already in the 8th century, fabric dyeing operations had been established, evident from crushed shells of murex. Nonetheless, only a meager picture of the cultural life of the earliest pioneers in the city can be conjectured, and not much about housing, monuments or defenses. The Roman poet Virgil imagined early Carthage when his legendary character Aeneas had arrived there, and Aeneas found where lately huts had been marvelous buildings, gateways, cobbled ways, and din of wagons. There the Tyrians were hard at work, laying courses for walls, rolling up stones to build the citadel, while others picked out building sites and ploughed a boundary furrow. Laws were being enacted, magistrates and a sacred senate chosen. Here men were dredging harbours. They laid the deep foundations of a theatre, and quarried massive pillars. The two inner harbours were located in the southeast, one being commercial and the other for war. The definite functions are not entirely known, probably for the construction, outfitting, or repair of ships, perhaps also loading and unloading cargo. Larger anchorages existed to the north and south of the city. North and west of the Kothon were located several industrial areas, e.g., metalworking and pottery, which could serve both inner harbors and ships anchored to the south of the city. About the Bursa, the citadel area to the north, considering its importance, our knowledge of it is patchy. Its prominent heights were the scene of fierce combat during the fiery destruction of the city in 146 BC. The Bursa was the reported site of the Temple of Eshmun, at the top of a stairway of 60 steps. A temple of Tanit was likely situated on the slope of the Lesser Bursa immediately to the east, which runs down toward the sea. Also situated on the Bursa were luxury homes. South of the citadel, near the Kothon, was the Tophet, a special and very old cemetery, which when begun lay outside the city's boundaries. Here the Salambo was located, the sanctuary of Tanit, not a temple but an enclosure for placing stone stelae. These were mostly short and upright, carved for funeral purposes. Evidence from here may indicate the occurrence of child sacrifice. Probably the Tophet burial fields were dedicated at an early date, perhaps by the first settlers. Between the sea-filled Kothon for shipping and the Bursa heights lay the Agra, the city-state's central marketplace for business and commerce. The Agra was also an area of public squares and plazas, where the people might formally assemble or gather for festivals. It was the site of religious shrines, and the location of whatever were the major municipal buildings of Carthage. Here beat the heart of civic life. In this district of the Carthage, more probably, the ruling suffets presided, the council of elders convened, the tribunal of the 104 met, and justice was dispensed to trials in the open air. Early residential districts wrapped around the Bursa from the south to the northeast. Houses usually were whitewashed and blank to the street, but within were courtyards open to the sky. In these neighborhoods multi-story construction later became common, some up to 6 stories tall according to an ancient Greek author. Several architectural floor plans of homes have been revealed by recent excavations, as well as the general layout of several city blocks. Stone stairs were set in the streets, and drainage was planned, e.g., in the form of soakways leaching into the sandy soil. Along the Bursa's southern slope were located not only fine old homes, but also many of the earliest grave sites juxtaposed in small areas, interspersed with daily life. Artisan workshops were located in the city at sites north and west of the harbors. The location of 3 metal workshops were found adjacent to the naval and commercial harbors, and another 2 were further up the hill toward the Bursa citadel. Sites of pottery kilns have been identified between the Agra and the harbors, and further north. Earthenware often used Greek models. A fuller's shop for preparing woolen cloth was evidently situated further to the west and south than by the edge of the city. Carthage also produced objects of rare refinement. During the 4th and 3rd centuries, the sculptures of the sarcophagi became works of art. Bronze engraving and stone carving reached the zenith. The elevation of the land at the promontory on the seashore to the northeast was twice as high above sea level as that at the Bursa. In between runs a ridge, several times reaching 50 meters. It continues northwestward along the seashore, and forms the edge of a plateau-like area between the Bursa and the sea. Newer urban developments lay here in these northern districts. Surrounding Carthage were walls of great strength, said in places to rise above 13 meters, being nearly 10 meters thick, according to ancient authors. To the west, 3 parallel walls were built. The walls altogether ran for about 33 kilometers to encircle the city. The heights of the Bursa were additionally fortified, this area being the last to succumb to the Romans in 146 BC. Originally the Romans had landed their army on the strip of land extending southward from the city. Ancient history. Greek cities contested with Carthage for the western Mediterranean, culminating in the Sicilian Wars and the Pyrrhic War over Sicily, while the Romans fought 3 wars against Carthage, known as the Punic Wars. Punic Republic. The Carthaginian Republic was one of the longest-lived and largest states in the ancient Mediterranean. Reports relay several wars with Syracuse and finally Rome, which eventually resulted in the defeat and destruction of Carthage in the Third Punic War. The Carthaginians were Phoenician settlers originating in the Mediterranean coast of the Near East. They spoke Canaanite, or Semitic language, and followed a local variety of the ancient Canaanite religion. The fall of Carthage came at the end of the Third Punic War in 146 BC at the Battle of Carthage. Despite initial devastating Roman naval losses and Rome's recovery from the brink of defeat after the terror of a 15-year occupation of much of Italy by Hannibal, the end of the series of wars resulted in the end of Carthaginian power and the complete destruction of the city by Scipio Aemilianus. The Romans pulled the Phoenician warships out into the harbor and burned them before the city, and went from house to house, capturing and enslaving the people. About 50,000 Carthaginians were sold into slavery. The city was set ablaze and razed to the ground, leaving only ruins and rubble. After the fall of Carthage, Rome annexed the majority of the Carthaginian colonies, including other North African locations such as Volubilis, Lixus, Chello, and Mogador. The legend that the city was sown with salt remains widely accepted despite lacking evidence among ancient historical accounts. R.T. Ridley found that the earliest such claim is attributed to B.L. Hallward's chapter in Cambridge Ancient History, published in 1930. Ridley contended that Hallward's claim may have gained traction due to historical evidence of other salted earth instances such as Abimelech's salting of Shechem in Judges chapter 9 verse 45. Many historians have since issued retractions acknowledging Ridley. B.H. Warmington similarly admitted fault in repeating Hallward's error, but posited that the legend precedes 1930 and inspired repetitions of the practice. For this reason, Warmington suggested that the symbolic value of the legend is so great and enduring that it mitigates the deficiency of concrete evidence that it happened and is useful to understand how subsequent historical narratives have been framed. Starting in the 19th century, various texts claimed that the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus Africanus plowed over and sowed the city of Carthage with salt after defeating it in the Third Punic War, sacking it and forcing the survivors into slavery. However, no ancient sources exist documenting the salting itself. The Carthage story is a later invention, probably modeled on the story of Shechem. The ritual of symbolically drawing a plow over the site of a city is, however, mentioned in ancient sources, though not in reference to Carthage specifically. When Pope Boniface VIII destroyed Palestrina in 1299, he issued a papal bull that it be plowed, following the old example of Carthage in Africa, and also salted. I have run the plow over it, like the ancient Carthage of Africa, and I have had salt sown upon it. Roman Carthage. When Carthage fell, its nearby rival Utica, a Roman ally, was made capital of the region and replaced Carthage as the leading center of Punic trade and leadership. It had the advantageous position of being situated on the outlet of the Maghreb River, Tunisia's only river that flowed all year long. However, grain cultivation in the Tunisian mountains caused large amounts of silt to erode into the river. This silt accumulated in the harbor until it became useless, and Rome was forced to rebuild Carthage. By 122 BC, Gaius Gracchus founded a short-lived colony, called Colonia Eunonia, after the Latin name for the Punic goddess Danica Eunoca Alestis. The purpose was to obtain arable lands for impoverished farmers. The Senate abolished the colony some time later, to undermine Gracchus's power. After this ill-fated attempt, a new city of Carthage was built on the same land by Julius Caesar in the period from 49 to 44 BC, and by the 1st century, it had grown to be the second largest city in the western half of the Roman Empire, with a peak population of 500,000. It was the center of the province of Africa, which was a major breadbasket of the empire. Among its major monuments was an amphitheater. Carthage also became a center of early Christianity. In the first of a string of rather poorly reported councils at Carthage a few years later, no fewer than 70 bishops attended. Tertullian later broke with the mainstream that was increasingly represented in the West by the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. But a more serious rift among Christians was the Donatist controversy, which Augustine of Hippo spent much time and parchment arguing against. At the 397 Council at Carthage, the biblical canon for the Western Church was confirmed. The political fallout from the deep disaffection of African Christians is supposedly a crucial factor in the ease with which Carthage and the other centers were captured in the 5th century by Genseric, king of the Vandals, who defeated the Roman general Bonifacius and made the city the capital of the Vandal kingdom. Genseric was considered a heretic, too, an Arian, and though Arians commonly despised Catholic Christians, a mere promise of toleration might have caused the city's population to accept him. After a failed attempt to recapture the city in the 5th century, the Eastern Roman Empire finally subdued the Vandals in the Vandalic War in 533 to 534. Thereafter, the city became the seat of the Praetorian Prefecture of Africa, which was made into an exarchate during the Emperor Maurus's reign, as was Ravenna on the Italian peninsula. These two exarchates were the western bulwarks of the Byzantine Empire, all that remained of its power in the west. In the early 7th century, the Exarch of Carthage overthrew the Byzantine Emperor Phocas. Islamic conquest. The Roman Exarchate of Africa was not able to withstand the 7th century Muslim conquest of the Maghreb. The Umayyad Caliphate under Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan in 686 sent a force led by Zahir ibn Qais, who won a battle over the Romans and Berbers led by King Qusayla of the Kingdom of Altava on the plain of Kairouan, but he could not follow that up. In 695, Hassan ibn al-Numan captured Carthage and advanced into the Atlas Mountains. An imperial fleet arrived and retook Carthage, but in 698, Hassan ibn al-Numan returned and defeated Emperor Tiberius III at the 698 Battle of Carthage. Roman imperial forces withdrew from all of Africa except Ceuta. Roman Carthage was destroyed, its walls torn down, its water supply cut off, and its harbors made unusable. The destruction of the Exarchate of Africa marked a permanent end to the Byzantine Empire's influence in the region. The Medina of Tunis, originally a Berber settlement, was established as the new regional center under the Umayyad Caliphate in the early 8th century. Under the Aghlabids, the people of Tunis revolted numerous times, but the city profited from economic improvements and quickly became the second most important in the kingdom. It was briefly the national capital for the end of the reign of Ibrahim II in 902 until 909, when the Shiite Berbers took over Ifriqiya and founded the Fatimid Caliphate. Carthage remained a residential see until the High Medieval period, mentioned in two letters of Pope Leo IX dated 1053, written in reply to consultations regarding a conflict between the bishops of Carthage and Gumi. In each of the two letters, Pope Leo declares that, after the Bishop of Rome, the first archbishop and chief metropolitan of the whole of Africa is the Bishop of Carthage. Later, an archbishop of Carthage named Syriacus was imprisoned by the Arab rulers because of an accusation by some Christians. Pope Gregory VII wrote him a letter of consolation, repeating the hopeful assurances of the primacy of the Church of Carthage. Whether the Church of Carthage should still lie desolate or rise again in glory. By 1076, Syriacus was set free, but there was only one other bishop in the province. These are the last of whom there is mention in that period of the history of the sea.